All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm here today with Dominiek Hoens, who is probably one of my favorite Lacanian scholars working today, and who has actually written several essays on the intersection of Lacan's reading of Pascal. So as we have been studying Seminar 16, the meaning of Pascal for Lacan returns and returns as a sort of enigmatic point. So today, Dominiek has agreed to give us a presentation, which he has entitled, I love this title, by the way, Dominiek, Capital Owes Us Nothing, which he will present for about 40 minutes, and we will then have a Q&A with Dominiek. The rest of the group isn't able to make it today. We have a time difference, but I have questions from our study group comrades that we can raise in the Q&A. So thank you so much for being here. We're very honored to have your presentation and excited to discuss everything with you. So without further ado, Dominiek, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Daniel, for your kind words and for having me here today, and to allow me to present you some ideas on Lacan's reading of Pascal. So this is entitled Capital Owes You Nothing, which is a variation on actually this book by Leszek Kolakowski, God Owes Us Nothing, which I would strongly recommend as an introduction to Jansenism. It's very clear, it's very well argued, and it's super exciting also, the whole history of Jansenism. Lacan himself does not refer to the book, which would have been impossible because it's only published in 1995, but he does refer to Le Jansenisme de Louis Cognet, which is from 61, if memory serves me well, and Le Dieu Caché, or The Hidden God by Lucien Goldmann, published in 55. This is a book which I also will briefly talk about. But first of all, very introductory, a few facts about Pascal. It's a 17th century mathematician, scientist, physicist, philosopher, theologian. His father belonged to the noblesse de robe, which is an expression we'll encounter also when we briefly discuss Goldmann. That's the nobility of the robe, and that has to be distinguished from the noblesse d'épée, which is the more traditional noblesse of the nobility of the sword. So the robe were those who had functions, noble functions, as judges, as lawyers, as tax collectors, and etc. But more about this in a few minutes. Pascal had a mundane life. He was friends with libertines who didn't have to work, so they were bored, and they engaged in gambling as a pastime, which is of course important then to know as a background to Pascal's notorious wager. Another important moment in Pascal's life is the let's say, mystic experience he had, and which was written down in a memorial which one found after his death sewn into his clothes. And that's a report of a mystical experience involving the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and not the God of the philosophers, which I also will talk about today. And then, he's most well known for his apology of Christianity, which was unfinished, but then got posthumously published as in 1670 as Pensée, thoughts, which was written with the idea to have to defend, but also to convince people of the value of Christianity, and in a convincing, attractive manner, which must have been quite a task for, if you know about the pessimistic worldview and the pessimistic idea Jansenism and Pascal belong to, the movement of Jansenism has on human beings. Then from that perspective, to write an attractive picture, to paint an attractive picture of Christianity, which is of course quite a task. So that was the task he was setting himself. Why does Lacan discussed Pascal very briefly. I won't go into many journalistic details, but first of all, Pascal belongs to French culture in general. That's the second point I make here, is the object of outstanding scholarship, part of French popular culture, which you can see, for example, in the 1969 film by Eric Romer, My Night at Maud's, which of course Lacan does not discuss because it was only released after Seminar 16. But it's a very beautiful film, which is Pascalian in its structure, but also a lot of explicit Pascalian references. It's a source. Besides this, it's a source of inspiration for existentialism. And many thinkers, Marxists in particular, have an interest in Pascal's work. I'm thinking here of Henri Lefebvre, 2 volumes on Pascal, and Lucien Goldmann, The Hidden God, we already referred to, and then, of course, Louis Althusser, who in his theory of ideology uses Pascal, and particularly the third part of the wager, the notorious part where the person who's rationally convinced in that it's good to believe in God, to, let's say, take God's existence for granted, but then complains to the imaginary interlocutor, complains to Pascal, I see what you mean, I'm totally convinced, but still I don't believe. So what to do? And then Pascal gives the advice to act as if he believes, and then belief will naturally follow. And this is a famous passage Louis Althusser also uses in order to understand how ideology works. So why does Lacan discuss Pascal? Let's say it's in the air, it's part of French culture. It's also more on a personal level, which I will not talk about. But Lacan, why? Because there's not much information about that, and maybe it's not so interesting. But Lacan, throughout the seminar, expresses a few times that there is like a personal relation to Jansenism and to Pascal in particular, which we don't know, or at least I don't know anything more about. But what's interesting is more, let's say, the general feeling one gets about these 2 works, and one could talk about an affinity in more general terms, which I would like to illustrate by this quote you find in Seminar 16, page 182. It's the reference to the French edition, but you can easily find, because the English translation has this French page numbering in the margin of it. And there Lacan states, it's through an act, that we define the other as one. This act is an act of faith, but faith in what? Faith in our thought, whereas we know full well that this thought subsists only on the basis of signifying articulation. In the order of logic, we end up at nothing else than identifying the other with A, that is to find in the A the essence of the one supposed to thought, that is to say, determining thought itself as the effect, as the shadow of object A. I'm aware this is a little bit of a difficult quote, but I would like to point out, let's say, certain similarities to what Pascal is trying to do. So on the one hand, Pascal is also very much emphasizing the injunction to think. For example, in Pensée 200, man is only a very famous one. Man is only a reed, the weakest in nature, but he's a thinking reed. Thus, all our dignity consists in thought. Let's strive to think well. That's one of them. But then, opposed to that, or seemingly opposed to that, the heart has its reasons, of which reasons knows nothing. And heart here is not a metaphor for some sort of, irrational, unconscious emotional core, but the heart is a crucial problem for Christianity. It's the realm of faith. It's the domain of belief. That's actually, let's say, as an image. It's the point of contact between, on the one hand, the thinking human being, and on the other hand, God. And so Lacan agrees with Pascal on at least three things. The injunction to think well. So Lacan too, or psychoanalysis, or at least the Lacanian version of psychoanalysis, is not some sort of dark reference to emotions or to unconscious emotions, certainly not. It's really a very severe, let's say, way of thinking. It's really a demand. It's really, so Lacan really believed strongly in a rationalist approach, and so one has to think clearly, and one has to think making use of the most in his time, the new tools one has for thinking, which is logics and also game theory, as we will see. So that's one thing. On the other hand, there's an emphasis on the finitude of our thoughts. For Lacan, this is expressed basically with the idea that the other is not one, the other is inconsistent. There is something, we suppose the other to be one, we suppose the other to be a coherent like a universe of thought which closes upon itself, which is actually but that's actually Lacan's whole idea. The other is not one. There's a fundamental inconsistency at work. And let's say the name for that inconsistency, I think this is a problem from the very beginning of his work. One of the first publications Lacan had was a poem, and he published only one poem, and the title is Hiatus Irrationalis, the irrational gap, in 29, if I'm not mistaken. And he refers only once to it himself, and that's actually in Seminar 13, the object of psychoanalysis, precisely when discussing Pascal. So he quotes from his own poem without telling his audience but he quotes from it, and precisely in discussion of Pascal. So there's something fundamentally irrational at work in the order of ratio, in the order of thought. And Lacan had a fascination for mathematics and logics. And without going into details, in this seminar he also discusses Fibonacci. And I think one of the reasons is precisely Fibonacci series is obtained. I think most of you are familiar with that. You add each number is the addition of the two numbers that precede it. And what's so remarkable about this series is that the relation between two subsequent numbers, the ratio of these numbers tends towards a very special number. This is 0.618 and etc. It's an irrational number, and it's also known as the so-called golden number or the golden ratio, which is super present everywhere in nature, in architecture. But I won't go into these details, but simply go to the important aspect of it here is that this number, this ratio between the numbers of the series, which is just a series and just a series of numbers, what's actually hidden in that series is an irrational number. So it's what the Greeks called an allogon. It has no ratio, and what is an irrational number, there is no way to put it into a fraction of natural numbers. So there's a series of natural numbers, but the logos of this series of rational numbers is actually an irrational number. This is, I think, what fascinates Lacan very much. Okay, so now to Jansenism. So it's of course very sketchy, but I think there is some sort of affinity in the sense of this emphasis on mathematics, on logics, on the power of rational thought on the one hand, and on the other hand, what limits this rational thought. And this is for Lacan, I think, his basic task, how to conceptualize this limit and how to think it. And I think that's what he sees in Pascal, that Pascal is also trying to do this, because when we move to the wager, we will see the same structure. It is a rational argument. in order to prove not that God exists, but that it's wise, that it's rational to bet on God existence. But Lacan singles out, or what is the right word, excavates in a certain way some sort of irrational element, which a spectral element, which is how would I say, which organizes this whole rational calculus, what one should do with respect to the existence or non-existence of God. But now first, a couple of words about Jansenism. Jansenism comes from Cornelius Jansen, which is the author of the posthumously published book, 3 volumes on Augustine and Augustinian theology. And he was a professor in theology at Louvain and a bishop of Ypres, which is in Flanders. And this book influences his friend de Saint-Cyran and Arnaud and other people who will belong to the movement of Jansenism, which of course was only named as such after the publication of this book on Augustine, because that book became the object of heavy debate, and the people who endorsed the book, who found inspiration in the book, were called Jansenists. And they were called Jansenists by their arch enemies, which were the Jesuits, which were the dominant, let's say, movement within Catholic France. So this book and the whole movement of Jansenism leads to severe polemic. And again, if you want to hear and read more about it, I can only recommend the 2 books I already referred to, the one by Louis Cognet and the other one by Kolakowski. And the book got, it's extreme, I cannot go into that. Maybe Peter Rollins talked about it. It would take too long, but it's super fascinating how people discuss and what sort of politics, because there is politics of the discussion via Rome and getting the other party condemned. So the Jesuits indeed, in the end, managed to get the book condemned by the Pope, Innocentius X, and which is an event in a certain way, and which pushes the Jansenists in a certain, let's say, defensive position. What is the whole argument or the whole discussion about? Of course, I don't mean to intend to summarize a book of more than 1,000 pages and a debate that took place over spanning decades. It's impossible to do that, but let's say basically it revolves around the issue of grace. It's all about grace. The issue of divine grace. And for the theses that got condemned first separately and then identified in the book, like, you know, you cannot, as a Christian, you cannot endorse these theses. And then they found these theses in the book by Jansen. So via a detour, the book by Jansen got condemned. And one of these theses is, does God demand the impossible from us? And you have the Pelagian point of view on that. Pelagius is a contemporary of Augustine. And to put it very simply, where Augustine is the main source of inspiration for Jansenism, but is also a church father, so a very, very important figure in Christianity. Pelagius was the let's say, the polemical opposite of Augustine. Augustine would emphasize the fallen state of human beings. It would emphasize the impact of original sin. Whereas Pelagius, of course, also would say, yes, indeed, yes, people are fallen creatures and etc. But they have, let's say, the power and the freedom to do the good. And if you have the power and the freedom to do the good, you work for your own salvation. You see, I mean, it's because of this, you have to have that freedom in order to do good works. And if you do good works, you can get saved mainly after your life. You know, what awaits you in the afterlife, you don't know, but you can work for it. You can work for the future in a way. Yes, you can, would be the slogan of Pelagius. So does God demand the impossible from us? No, Pelagius would say. No, no, no. He may be quite demanding, but the things which are asked from us belong to the realm of the possible. It may be difficult, but it's possible. The Jesuits take in a middle position with respect to, on the one hand, Pelagius, on the other hand, the Jansenism and the Protestants, which is, of course, very much at the background, and the Jansenists too. In Catholic, they didn't want to leave the church, so they wanted to belong to the Katholos, the universality of Christianity, and not to be, also have to know it's in the context of the religious wars and etc. So it's very, what's the word? It's these topics are very touchy topics. It's not just abstract discussion as a pastime, whereas other people gamble. We discuss the existence of God and the nature of divine grace and etc. No. This has direct social, political consequences. So the Jesuits will argue that, yes, of course, we are all sinners, but God gives us is graceful. So what we deserve is damnation. That's a basic Christian thesis. But there is not only damnation, there is also grace, God's graceful intervention. And this can create the conditions within which we can freely choose the good. And this is summarized by the notion of sufficient grace. And so God's grace, which is, let's say, distributed among all of us, should suffice for us to then, in freedom, we can also choose evil, and we are also attracted to evil because of our sinful nature. But still, there is some sort of, with the help of God, some chance, some possibility to do the good. So, does God demand the impossible from us? No, in the sense that if God helps us, then it's possible. The Jansenists, if God helps us, then we can act in such a way that indeed we can do, what's actually demanded from us. The Jansenists will say, no, God doesn't demand the impossible from us. Why is it impossible to do the good? Because indeed we are thoroughly sinful beings, and to believe is to start from the idea, and that makes it so tragic, If also Goldmann talks about the tragedy or the tragic worldview of Jansenism, it's this, and you also find it in Kierkegaard, Christianity is a task. A Christian is not something you are. You can never say that you are a Christian. It is a demand. It is a task. To be, but it's an impossible task, and that makes it so torn, so deeply painful also in a way. It's the one thing you have to do and have to be in life, and you can't. And knowing this, realizing this, makes us implore for God's mercy. But that's the Jansenist idea. God's mercy, we don't deserve it. That's a basic Christian idea. We only deserve hell, and we only deserve sin. And we only, there's nothing we can expect from God. But for the Jesuits, you can still imagine that God's grace is actually distributed to all. For the Jansenists, it's only to a few elect people. A small group of people can, for no reason, so it's impenetrable, you don't understand, you cannot bargain, you cannot force God to give you grace or whatever, or to intimidate or to seduce God or whatever. No, this is all impossible. For some impenetrable, obscure reasons, some can be saved and some will be saved. And if God decides so, then you're indeed saved and you're also capable of doing the good. And that's called efficient grace. So it's very close to Protestant theology. And that's the huge problem Jansenists always have, to distinguish themselves from the Protestants. Because in the Protestant theology, it also all depends on God's grace. So human freedom is an illusion, or human freedom plays no role in, and Jansenists always have then to don't go into it. So it's also extremely difficult because they have to combine then, let's say, the necessity of God's grace, and also, but still it's a necessity, and it's sufficient. So with God's grace, you're able to do the good, but still you do it in freedom. And the question is, what is freedom precisely there? Fortunately, I'm not doing theology, but philosophy and psychoanalysis, so I skip over this difficult, thorny issue now. Let's move now to Goldmann, and actually have some, maybe we can then discuss after the presentation a bit more about it. But in my research, I was a bit, let's first of all say it's a bit long, it's a bit repetitive book on the tragic worldview of Jansenism. And it's most known for its hypothesis. It is that Jansenist pessimism and its tragic worldview is the expression of a certain class, the noblesse de robe, which I already referred to, the nobility of the robe, which then this class felt excluded. Why? So you had the traditional noblesse d'épée, the sword, and you had the robe, but power became, under Louis XIV, became gradually much more centralized, and also the bureaucratization of power, which took place under Louis XIV, made these people who locally and traditionally were local, locally working as lawyers and as tax collectors and as judges and etc., made them superfluous. It's as simple as that. There was no role for them anymore. Which sounds in a certain way, a bit Christian. If you imagine that Louis XIV is some sort of god, which is, sorry to mix up so many different thoughts at the same time, but that's also why Louis XIV was very suspicious about Jansenism, because Jansenism was had a very, let's say, clear view on power. And in the sense that power is something which is endowed, which you get from the people who see you as a king. You're never a king. You're not a king by divine decision or whatever. It's simply a matter of convention, and you should be well aware of this, that this can easily change. And Jansenism are not revolutionary in the sense that they think that the political order should change, but they're very much aware that it can change. And of course, this is contradictory to the idea of an absolute royal or le roi soleil, who actually is God's representative on earth, let's say. So this is why Jansenism was very much approached with suspicion from by Louis XIV, and eventually he will destroy, let's say, Port Royal, which was the cloister where a lot of these Jansenists, there was a cloister for nuns, but there were also solitaires, so people who retreated from life. So people were really like, when they converted to Jansenism, it was the world is a world of lie, of corruption and sin. So really, unlike the Protestants who were really engaged in the world, the Jansenism would retreat from the world. But they still saw it as like, as a cradle, let's say, of anti-monarchic, if this is correct English, but you know what I mean, anti-royal thoughts, and that's why it eventually got destroyed by Louis XIV. And there is some historians who say that the origins of French Revolution is to be found in Jansenism. So, but there's a heavy debate about that, about the precise role and etc. This is not the issue now. The issue now is that that's the thesis of Lucien Goldmann, that Jansenism is an expression, is an ideology, but is the expression of a certain class, So it is a certain collective consciousness in a certain way. People who feel that they are obsolete, who are superfluous, and as an expression of that, Jansenism gets created. And if they don't actively create Jansenism, let's say, their economic situation gets reflected in Jansenist theology. This is Goldmann's strong thesis, very Marxist, you know. You see the Jansenism as the ideology, the superstructure, the way people relate to the world and think about the world, but is actually caused by some sort of underlying economical reason. And Goldmann situates this, identifies this with, as I already said, certain changes which made this noblesse de robe obsolete, superfluous. Now, the problem is that this hypothesis has been proved to be factually wrong. So if you read Gérard Pommier is a psychoanalyst, I mean René Pommier, I can give you the references afterwards, but also this article, Goldmann Visionnaire by Gérard Ferreyrol. So historians who did research on the hypothesis, one also has to say that Goldmann himself at times he sounds a little bit apodictic, but most of the time he's very modest in a way. It's a mere hypothesis. And the unfortunate or fortunate thing is that when doing researching his thesis, his hypothesis, one has to conclude that it's factually wrong. So the Jansenist movement did not consist primarily of noblesse de robe, and vice versa. The majority of the noblesse de robe did not turn to Jansenism. Moreover, the whole idea that they were like socially, economically in a bad situation is also wrong, because many of the new bureaucrats, so many of the people who would join, you know, in the central bureaucracy would be recruited among the noblesse de robe, and the noblesse de robe, who indeed got marginalized, who indeed failed to retain or obtain a new important post in the France of Louis XIV, is precisely because of the Jansenism. So it's not the other way around, you know. It's not because I am marginalized that I turn to Jansenism or find in Jansenism the expression of some sort of socio-economical discontent. No, it's the other way around. It's because of turning to Jansenism that certain people belonging to the noblesse de robe get marginalized. Okay, I see them, maybe I should speed up a little bit, and I would like to turn now to the wager, and maybe because about the wager we can say many things, but I think maybe some people whom you had on your show before already did this, so maybe I don't have to do it. I just want to point out that there is a certain moment in the wager that leaves no choice. Ça la haute tout parti is particularly singled out by Lacan in order, and I won't go into the explanation now, but it's a mathematical argument which is important for Lacan. It's about the stake, you know. When you put something on the table and you start to gamble, you have to consider the stake as lost. This sounds now maybe common knowledge, but that was a new idea, you know, how to deal, how to calculate. But then again, I will not go into details, but that's maybe one important element, that you have to consider what you're investing, let's say, or what you're putting on the table. You have to consider it as lost. It may return in one way or another, or it may return with a surplus, but the initial start of the game is that you lose what you actually stake. This is, of course, reminds one of the object A as the placeholder object of something that got irreparably structurally lost. That is, of course, must have triggered Lacan's interest in Pascal's thinking through what is actually gambling and what is actually a game, what is actually a wager. And this is the fragment or the part which I already referred to, which Althusser uses. This ideology produces a subject that retroactively considers itself to be the agents of what it does. You know, you do these stupid things like in Pascal. If you don't believe, just kneel. You know, sing in the mass and whatever. You don't believe, so you do it out of you don't know for what reason, but by doing it, you will start to believe and retroactively think that you always did it out of belief in God, which is the there's a lot to say about that, one thing is how to situate this within such a cynical thought, it's about the most important matter, the most crucial issue, belief, and then you get that sort of advice, pretend, fake it until you make it in a certain way. So that's weird, but I think there's ways, of course, to explain it, and one of the elements one should mention is that, of course, this kind of actions are for Pascal are the sort of actions which you don't do with your ego or out of self-love, and that's very important too. Belief or faith belongs to the realm where self-love, let's say, has no role to play, and this is one of the things, or one of the advices Pascal gives in a way, and more in general, is to turn yourself into a beast. And this is now maybe a little bit confusing, but that means ça vous abattira, that turns you into a beast. That means it will make you more docile. And Lacan quotes this approvingly, in the sense that animals don't have self-love. So you have to imitate in a certain way or become like an animal in that respect, that you have to get rid of your self-love. And just precisely by doing these actions, which are humbling, which are like, it's about kneeling, it's about making yourself more docile. So that's definitely part of Pascal's advice to, if you want to believe, how to do it, how to end up believing. So now that we are talking about the wager, Lacan will first of all give a game theoretical matrix, which consists of 4 possibilities. You can either gamble or wager for the existence of God or against it, and then God can turn out to exist or not exist. So that's very simple, 2 alternatives, and I give 4 different outcomes, which I will discuss in a second. But why do I, let's say, not go into I will say something more about it in a second, but let's first of all remark that those, and I quote from Lacan, those who want to understand Pascal's wager in game theoretical way miss the point, which is interesting, because he spends a lot of time himself talking about Pascal's wager from a game theoretical point of view, and then dismisses it. And so what is the point then? As a reader, you do all this, it takes a lot of time to follow Lacan's torturous argument, like how it's precisely, how these 4 possible outcomes, how to understand them, what is actually happening there, and then you get the message, but you actually missed the point. So what is the point? And the point is, the true sense or meaning of the wager is indicated, and that's a quote, is indicated by Pascal himself when he states that you are committed, vous êtes embarqué. And what is committed, so what is embarqué or engagé, is je, and it's written with a capital, is je. It's the moment of entrance of the je is French for I, in the issue. So in the game, loss is already there. There's also try to point out with this partie, the whole question of the partie in the wager. There's a loss from the very start. So how could we here ignore the function of grace that is the desire of the other? So this refers to the French, and this also. So if you want to look where Lacan criticizes his own game theoretical approach, these are the 2 important passages. So how to understand this? What do you miss in a purely game theoretical approach? It's in a game theoretical approach, it's a mere calculus, it's you stake something or you don't stake something, and there's a possible reward or there's no reward, so there's like all these 4 possible situations. But for Lacan, the importance of the wager resides elsewhere, and it resides in the divine grace, which we already encountered when talking about Jansenism. And for Lacan, the divine grace is the desire of the other. So which means that the matrix or the gambling table we just saw is not about the neutral calculus allowing for the best choice, because that's of course what probability theory does, and Pascal is the father of probability theory. It's the so-called taming of chance. You do not know what the future will be, but you can map out 4, 5, 6, whatever, but you can map out 4 possible options, 4 possible outcomes, and you can give them, let's say, a certain value to these options. So it's not, but Lacan's point is, it's not about the neutral calculus. It's not about the neutral taming of chance, but it rests upon something that is missing, a structural lack. So the whole, and there you see how Lacan reads Pascal's wager. There is something, it's conditioned upon something. So something precedes the whole wager, and the name for that is the desire of the other. And this desire is equated with divine grace, because is this desire, this something that God wants from me, and this is the initial starting point. God wants something from me. This desire is traumatic in the sense that it's opaque, yet it concerns me, you know. It's even, let's say, if it's about the je, you are engaged, vous êtes embarqué, it is about your existence, in the sense that what are you with respect to God? Even if that's the whole thing in Jansenism, God is impenetrable, God is absent, God is hidden, hence the title of Lucien Goldmann, the hidden God. We don't know God, we do not know what God wants, but that precisely makes it into some sort of continuous traumatic presence. It's the divine grace, let's say, you can hope for it, you can expect it, but the point of origin of the divine grace is actually that God wants something from you. Or grace is then also another name that Lacan, or another formulation that Lacan gives for it is "let your will be done." That's in the Christian prayer. Let your will be done. Let your will be done. And that's why Lacan sides along Pascal with the God of revelation we already saw or encountered in that memorial. The God of revelation is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the God that speaks against the God of the philosopher, who is actually a function, who's there to fill the holes in the universe. The God of the Jansenist, the God of revelation, is a God that introduces a desire. You know, God wants something, although we do not know what. So, what I said is already is important. It's here, like here, but this is maybe the important conclusion. The wager is a phantasmatic scenario involving a desiring other and the subject, the wagerer, as the object of the desire of the other. In brief, it's a phantasm, which is a technical psychoanalytic term, a fantasy, one can also say, as an answer to the enigma of the other. What does he want from me? Because the other is a desiring other, and the whole wager is actually a staging of possible ways of dealing with that desire, as if you have something to give to God, you know? And this is precisely the whole thing. In comparison to God, the life I can give is nothing. It's a zero. You know, God does not want us. You know, God is, self-sufficient, etc. But still, God appears as a desiring instance, and so it's nothing. But by the act of giving it, by the act of sacrificing it, by the act of renunciating earthly pleasures and etc., I turn it into something. And this is the magic, let's say, of the Pascalian wager, or at least how Lacan understands it. It's a phantasmatic scenario. It's as Pascal. So it's not a defense of Pascal, as Pascal is let's say, has the best idea about, it's very close, let's say, to what also Lacan would argue, where subjectivity comes from, subjectivity as a response to the opaque desire of the other. But at the same time, so Lacan would agree with Pascal on that point, that Pascal has seen this, and that is, but let's say at the same time, Pascal makes it into some sort of phantasmatic scenario where you can actually indeed give something to God, which would be in one way or another a reply to God's desire. So that's the whole thing, how to turn the nothingness of your life into something. It's like by the act of giving that you create the existence of the receiver. You know, it's through this sacrifice or self-sacrifice that you actually prove to yourself that the other exists in a way. This is the basic structure of Christian belief, one could say. So Lacan will then return to the matrix we already saw. And the strange thing is that he's not particularly interested in 1 and 4. So 1 is, let's now maybe go into the details of it, is you wager for the existence of God, and God exists, which means that you give something which is actually nothing, and you get an infinite reward in return. You know, you made the right choice in a certain way. And you sacrifice something, but you will see you actually sacrifice nothing. Life is anyway nothing for a Jansenism. It's full of boredom. It's full of fear of death. So actually, you don't sacrifice a lot, and you get an infinite reward. And here, the other case, the fourth one, is where you choose against God, and God turns out to not to exist. So you choose a life of earthly pleasures, and it turns out that indeed God does not exist. So indeed you get nothing in return, but you also didn't sacrifice anything. But in these two cases, Lacan is not particularly interested. He even says the gambler knows. This is very enigmatic to me, that the gambler knows. So in these cases, what the outcome will, it's strange, because if you gamble, of course, you don't know the outcome. But here Lacan makes a strange turn. It's as if one already knows the outcome. So it's as if gambling is already knowing the outcome, and here you make the safe choices. You know, if God exists, well, it's of course wise to bet on his existence. And if he doesn't exist, it's also, let's say, then wise to act as if, or indeed, as if he does not exist. But Lacan is interested in these two. In 2 and 3. If we start with 3, this is you bet on the existence of God, but God turns out not to exist. And Lacan calls this le pipère does this. Le pipère is, it's difficult to translate. I should actually have checked the English translation, but it means the good father, but like in a belittling connotation, little father in a certain way, the one who the pipère is that I would say the person who knows that God does not exist, but still pretends as if God, the one who would say guarantees tradition, and also one could say in a certain way, knowing that there is no guarantee, but acts as if it all coheres and as if there is a certain tradition one should adhere to, and etc. But the most interesting that Lacan and also pays most attention to is this one. You know that God exists, and you bet against him. And this is, of course, very interesting from a psychoanalytic point of view. This, you know that God exists, and you bet against him. You could say this is how to understand this. You know, first of all, it means that you keep a life of pleasure, yet hell will await me. And this is, of course, the question then: what is hell? First of all, also important to remark is that Pascal does not talk about hell in the context of the wager in the pensée. Remind, it has to be a positive apology of Christianity, so not talk about hell and eternal damnation too much, so it's left out. But you can conclude or deduce from his argument that indeed, if you gamble against God and he turns out to exist, that indeed hell awaits you. And the question is how to understand hell. Well, Lacan says we're already in hell, which is of course surprising. I mean, maybe indeed in Gaza or in certain Russian prisons or whatever, they could say yes, but I would not consider myself living in a hell, So I don't understand it, to be honest. If Lacan says we are already in hell, unless we understand it in Lacanian way. And what does that mean to understand it in Lacanian way? Is indeed that you're as a subject. So it's not about your conscious experience or how you feel, if you find life pleasant or a little bit unpleasant or whatever, but it's about what it means to be a subject of the signifier. And indeed, the subject of the signifier is that kind of eternal, let's say, yearning for existence, because as a subject of the signifier, you are put to death because you're merely represented by the symbolic order, but you're never in the symbolic order, so you lose your life in a certain way, but at the same time, you have that yearning to exist. So it's a manque à être, it's a lack of being, and it's a movement from one signifier to the other, which represents you without making you present, and it's this which is for Lacan, which is hell, or at least that's how I understand hell is both like it's beyond death, because as a subject you're death, and at the same time you're immortal. You're like living an immortal life beyond death. And that's why I think in the same passages he refers to Freud's hysterics, which testify indeed to some sort of indestructible desire, to some sort of indestructible pain, which is expressed via the symptom and the problems they talk about. There's also the technical discussion of the infinite happy life, but I won't go into that. If you're interested in that, there is an article I wrote on it, Is Life But a Pascalian Dream, where you get all the details of the Pascalian, but I will not go into that. But it is interesting, because then you, for example, see how close a reader Lacan was. He goes to the manuscript of the Wager, not just the edition, but the origin of the text, and then sees that a certain expression by Pascal can be understood in one way or another way. But okay, I leave it. If you're interested in that, I refer to my own article. And so there is some sort of infinity that's, let's say, part and parcel of the subject. There's some sort of infinite yearning, some sort of infinite pain, which accompanies subjectivity. So that's the hell we're living in. What is then the A? Well, A is the surplus, that in respect to the infinity of God. So God does not really need anything, but still I think there is something I can keep or I can give. So I can fantasize that it can be staked, and as such fulfill God's desire, but a psychoanalytic act. And that would be a good way, I think, to describe psychoanalysis as distinguished from Christianity. The problem in Christianity is how to be a believer. Even if you think you believe, you still, you can never be sure of your own belief. So it's an infinite task to to become what you should be, but it's actually an impossible task. And so that would be the aim of a Christian, is to become a Christian. The aim of psychoanalysis is to become, if it's actually starting from the other way, is saying you are a believer, but it's how to become a non-believer, how to get rid of this, because that's the thing, Lacan talks about, with a lot of sympathy, about Pascal, and you can refer to Pascalian affinities, and you can say Lacan as a Catholic, and etc. But at the same time, of course, he introduces a new discourse, which is the analytical discourse, which is, it's non-Christian, It is precisely an instrument to get rid of this sort of fantasies, this basic. You cannot easily get rid of that fantasy, Lacan says, that idea that you are something which can be given away to someone who wants something of you of which you don't know what it is, that sort of fantasy. You need a precise technique and a precise practice to be able to analyze this and to get rid of this and to get this undone. And this is what the psychoanalytic act consists of. It's precisely to undo this, not to undo this intricate relation between subjectivity and other. And so, but still, again, so as an effect, the other appears as desiring. I give something, so I imagine, I pretend the other to be desiring, and the object as a virtual enjoyment. Why virtual? Well, it's an enjoyment dependent on and supposed to another. It's also a sort of surplus, which Lacan will refer to Marx. It's the surplus, which is which is like a spectral object, which is running through capitalistic economy. It's all about the production of surplus. And this is the analogy he sees between Pascal and Marx. So this, I'll wrap up, but allow me to just briefly say two more things. First of all, is Pascal then an apologist of course, certainly of Christianity, but is he an apologist of capitalism? I find this a difficult question, which you can not so simply say yes or no. There are, let's say, elements which testify to a capitalist spirit, to use that expression. First of all, what I find so fascinating about Pascal, you see that it's of course a modern thinker. For example, it's a lot about probability. So it's a little about a mathematical approach to reality. God does not exist, it's a matter of you cannot be sure about that. There's no being. You can only bet on a certain future. And that's very important, I think. You see that this modernity of Pascal expresses itself very clearly in what I would call the invention of the future in Pascal. Of course, there's always been some sort of future, but Pascal is very much, in a certain way, expresses this it's like a problem. For example, in Pensée 47, we almost never think of the present. And if we do think of it, it's only to see what light it throws on our plans for the future. The present, this is something. The present is never our end. The past and the present are our means. The future alone our end. Thus we never actually live, but hope to live. So you could say we belong to the future, which is a very tragic idea also, with all this idea of embracing the present, etc. You have this, it's the same in capitalism. It's a bet, it's a wager on the future. This is the basic, let's say, logic or dynamic of capitalism. It's of course investment. You live and work for the future. Another quote is Saint Augustine saw that we take chances at sea, in battle, etc., but he did not see the rule of probability. The règle de partie, there we have it again, which proves that we ought to. That indeed that there is a mathematical approach to the future. There's not only the future, but there is actually a sound, reasonable, mathematically underpinned approach to the future. So it's all, a lot of the things, or the thing is you don't exist in the present. You exist, or you belong to the future. That's one element. Another element is Christianity, and particularly Jansenism, is a lot about guilt and debt. Debt, your superfluous existence, staying in a perfect world. It's horrible to be a human being, but yet you existed. So, and it's an existence which needs to be justified. So why are you here? To another to whom one owes one existence. So you have to be grateful on the one hand for an existence, at the same time you have to justify your existence. And that reminds me of a quote in De Grundrisse by Marx. It's the laborer who owes his existence to capitalism. So you see, it's your existence, you owe your existence to, not here God, but to capital, which in return asks you to prove that you're actually allowed and justified to exist, you know. So you owe your existence to capital, and that existence in itself is very problematic. So you have to, on the one hand, be very grateful, and at the same time be burdened with guilt in a certain way, because you cannot live up to the demands which are actually placed onto you. So this is a lot of this spirit of debt, and not debt as if something you can calculate, but like a fundamental positioning in life where you have to prove that you have the right to exist, to put it in very simple terms, which I think, especially today, we feel and experience very much again. You know, it's not Christian, but I think there's an analogy here to make between Christianity and capitalism, is to be confronted with that question, whether you have the right to exist or not. And a third element is the hedonism. I think this makes Pascal, let's say, still in the end digestible in a certain way. It's a calculus of pleasure, and you give up one pleasure, but you get maybe a bigger one in return, which is very difficult to combine with his idea about grace and etc. But I won't go into that difficult. But it's not so often remarked how the wager actually fits within a larger Jansenist theology, you know, because it's a hedonist. Of course, when people say he's talking to a non-believer, a man of pleasure, you know, who only gambles and goes hunting, you know, that kind of man, he has to convince him of religion. But I think that that begs a little bit the question, or doesn't it answer in a satisfying way, because the wager has such an important place, and the question is how to situate it with this with respect to this more general idea of efficient grace, that you're not capable of believing without God's help and God's gracious gift of faith and belief. But anyway, there's a lot of in the wager particularly, there's a lot of hedonism, you could say, or at least like some sort of imagined pleasure, which you could say that is also sounds very contemporary. It's the promise of a certain pleasure you will get in return for your self-sacrifice. And then the last thing I want to say, and then I really stop, is that I think if I would work more about it, and I'm actually working on it, but I cannot give you more details, is that I think that the doctrine of pure love, which is also a 17th century theological debate, which also got condemned by the Pope. It's a little bit later. And it's the doctrine of pure love. And I want you to, just by way of a coda to what I just been talking about, to follow the reasoning. So the reasoning is here: we as human beings are evil, corrupt, and marked by sin. This is basic Christianity, you know, this is Jansenism also. We don't deserve to be saved. That's another basic axiom, dogma of Christianity. We don't deserve it. So we cannot expect to be saved, for God is just. So God is just. That means as a just judge, he is just, and the only just judgment on us is that we deserve damnation. But at the same time, and that's a huge problem for Christianity, he could save us, you know. He could do so in an act of mercy, you know. He could overrule his own justice and act out of in a graceful gift and be merciful and save us. But he doesn't do so. And then the doctrine of pure love becomes very interesting, because then the question is, of course, blasphemous, very difficult thought: is God evil? Maybe, you know, he could save us, but he doesn't do so. He's not saving us while he could do so. And then the conclusion of the doctrine of pure love is, no, God is not evil. On the contrary, it's actually very good what God does, because he leaves us with nothing to expect. You cannot expect anything from God. And that non-expectation is actually a gift why is that a gift? If someone doesn't give you something you would want, but of course don't deserve, but you would want it, but you still don't get it, that is actually a supreme or a sublime gift, because it's something good, for it allows us to love God without expecting anything in return. You see, because you don't get anything from God, you are, let's say, discover in yourself a love for God as that, let's say, instance, who could actually save you easily because he's almighty and omnipotent, but he doesn't do so, and he doesn't do so, but not doing so is actually a good deed, because it makes us discover in ourselves a totally disinterested, a pure, unconditional love for God. You see, love is usually guided by self-love, by some sort of hedonistic calculus, and etc. But it's only in relation to God that you discover yourself, something in yourself which you would not have discovered otherwise, which is a love which is totally devoid of self-interest or self-love and or whatsoever. It's a purely, let's say, a pure disinterested love. And I think this is, I think, the truth of Jansenism. The truth of Jansenism is a doctrine of pure love, in the sense that in Pascal, there's still like a calculus, a hedonistic calculus, and you can follow it or not follow it. There are all sorts of problems with Pascal's reasoning, but there's still like some sort of rationality to it, both on the mathematical level, but also, let's say, also on what actually motivates the wager, and what motivates the wager is a calculus, is a hedonistic calculus, and here, and I think this is like a certain veil for something much more obscure, is that you're actually invited to love or to relate and to situate yourself within or with respect to an instance which actually will destroy you, because it's God which leads you to damnation, which will judge on you, and judge on you in a negative way. And precisely this instance which will do this, this instance precisely, you have to love in an unconditional way. And I think this sort of very to love what destroys you, or to give yourself away, realizing that you're like a totally superfluous waste let's say in the creation of God. So it's actually, you give yourself, but even that gift is not worthy of being given. That total self-negation is, I think, is something which underlies Pascal's reasoning of the wage. But I can't go into detail here, but I think it's interesting also to take this into account, especially when you're talking about capitalism and the way it addresses it to all of us, to love what actually destroys you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. My goodness, that was a tour de force. Congratulations on that. I have a whole page of notes and observations that I want to go through with you. Thank you for such a clear and thorough exposition on Seminar 16. The three references to the Jansenist texts are essential, I think, for everyone. And of course, for myself, I was drawn to the Kołakowski and to the Goldmann texts in particular. I haven't read the third. Many questions. Can we begin with a little bit of a commentary on the hidden God, this concept of the hidden God, and then we will connect back to psychoanalysis and Lacan's particular concerns, because they are very much interwoven. A couple things. First off, the pessimism of Jansenism, according to Lucien Goldmann, I think needs a certain situated clarification. Because, yes, he may be factually wrong regarding the origin of the noblesse des robes and their particular subjectivity, but he's trying to concoct a trans-historical claim working off of the framework of Georgi Lukács in History and Class Consciousness, that the ideology of bourgeoisie finds and must develop itself a paradoxical pessimism. And so for, let's give an example. Like you have a class that is interested in a relationship to power, to the status quo of existing hierarchies and social domination. And the claim of Lukács and Goldmann is that any ruling class needs an ideology that serves as the justification of its maintenance, of its fluidity, of its continuity, and so on. And therefore, the transhistorical claim is that in capitalist society, you also have a subordinated or a dominated class. And this dominated class itself must be thought of as participating in its own version of a wager, on the possibility of the future, that its own collective existence can move from the nothing to an achievement. This is what I would call the wager of Pascalian Marxism. Now, Lacan is sort of inserting himself in Pascalian Marxism as a critic. And I think one thing that's overlooked is that, of course, all of the people flocking to his seminar room, are they not libertines themselves? Are they not in a similar class position to the precise audience of Pascal's pensée? In a certain way, if that makes sense. I think that's an interesting comparison. And the other point I would make is that optimism, pessimism, this idea that the future that Pascal opens through the wager, one of the things that Lacan is saying to Marxist priests or to Marxist intellectuals is, of course, that they are becoming what he calls savants, and savants of thought, a subjectivity, a theory of the subject of thought. And you mentioned in your opening that Lacan is interested in retaining the subject of thought, but Goldmann, I guess you could say, errs because he doesn't have a true account of Freud's intervention in the subject of thought, meaning he doesn't have a true account of how pleasure operates on subjectivity. So therefore, Goldmann's theory of the proletariat is partial, is missing something. It's missing it's missing enjoyment. So my question would always be, not so much what Kołakowski is interested in, which is sort of discarding Goldmann's proletarian theory of the wager, because that's kind of what 68 did. It showed that the Western working class cannot make a solidarity with the students. It cannot transform itself. Something was blocked. It was a failure. So what's the meaning of that failure, right? And Lacan will say something that Marxism is partially to blame for this failure, including Goldmann, who he calls a priest and he ridicules and so on. So could you say something more about this point, about the proletariat in a certain way? Because I feel that that's the heart of what interests me about Goldmann's. And you're right, it's very speculative. It's not meant to be, I don't know. We should not so easily discard it if the empirical point he makes on noblesse des robes is flawed. There's maybe more to it than just this point, because, of course, he wants to say that Marx is the modern Pelagius in a certain way. You see my point? Like, in other words, he says Marxism re-inaugurates the great debate between Augustine and Pelagius, in the sense that Marxism stands for, and be careful how I use this word, a utopian wager on the future, that the collective existence of the subordinated class can transform itself. That's Marxism. Marxism is a wager that collective existence can modify itself. Jansenism and the pessimistic bourgeois ideology would be no, it cannot. It's individualist. That's why he compares Pascal to Robinson Crusoe. You remember that reference? It's a kind of interminable individualism. And I think Goldmann, because what is Goldmann's theory? Trans-individualism, right?
Yeah.
Your thoughts on this? I'm raising this for a conversation. Your spontaneous reflections, please.
Yes. Of course, these are very difficult and multifaceted questions we cannot solve, and definitely not me. But try to first. What I'm reminded of is that, of course, I was doing some research and I was looking. Does Lacan discuss Goldmann anywhere else than in Seminar 16? And he does not really discuss Goldmann in 16. There's a reference. There's not really. Although he mentions it, which is already means a lot in
3 times. He says in the beginning, where he gives him the name of Mudger Muddle, and then he references him a second time, and then the third time where he talks about the book, The Hidden God, and why he finds it flawed.
Yeah, voila. But it remains very, let's say, short, a little bit, opaque. But okay. So I was looking for other passages, and there is one more passage. It's actually in the transcription of the discussion which took place in Baltimore in 1966. There was a huge conference on structuralism and humanities. Which Goldmann attended, Lacan, Derrida, Jean Hippolyte, the big, le tout Paris était là. And so Lacan reacts to Goldmann's lecture. And it's not particularly, or it's not so interesting, but it's, let's say, significant. Because indeed, Goldmann talks about trans-individualism, and talks about, for example, collective action. And he says, when John and Paul are carrying a table, they are one subject. So there is, what is the subject of this? Of course, they're 2 separate individuals, but in the act of carrying a table, there's one subjectivity involved. The carrier are these 2 people. And even when they talk to each other, or precisely when they talk to each other, he calls it an not inter, but intra-subjective dialogue. So, and Lacan responds to that. And Lacan says, well, it reminds me of an experience he had a couple of days before, that he was asking people to help him with moving a table in his hotel room. And then he asked someone, and that person who asked reacted with indignation, because it was the bellman. And you're not supposed to ask the bellman. You're supposed to ask the housekeeper to help you with moving the table. And it goes on like this. But I think the conclusion, it's very obscure. When Lacan tries to explain something, it's very often, not that easy to follow. But I think the conclusion is that he says that, in this, and that's a bit of a cheap criticism in a way of American society. American society is characterized by demands, but in French, demand is, it's something you ask for, and people who help you. So it's a dynamic of help, and what you get the help or not the help. Can I help you? Is like the basic, also a way of almost introducing yourself to someone else. Can I help you? And Lacan criticizes this. He criticizes this in the sense that he refers to desire. And desire is, of course, something very problematic. Desire emerges when you don't get what you want, or when you get what you want, but you want something, it's not that, And that's what he refers to, or what he understands as subjectivity. And that makes it, or how would I say, this is the whole difficulty to do something with psychoanalysis, or to immediately derive some sort of ethics or politics from it. It's an ethics of desire, and it's all about living human being is about misrecognizing the dimension of desire. An analysis, or it becomes interesting when desire comes to the fore, when desire as that structural, irreparable lack becomes evident. And that's the whole enterprise of psychoanalysis. And that's indeed, if you say that Goldmann is missing something, it's that dimension of desire. It's this dimension of a fundamental lack, which, if you talk about the carrying of the table, it's not one people, it's not one subject, but it's actually desire which is carrying the table from a psychoanalytic point of view. And this is the dimension, one could say, that Goldmann is lacking. This said, I think when you read Goldmann and the betting on the future and the wagering on the future, and even the collective subjectivity, you find a lot of resonances and echoes in the early Lacan. I will not explain it here, but if you're interested, one can read the argument on logical time, which is an early text by Lacan, and is a collective. It was a larger project, he said, on which he only published 2 articles, and is a collective logic. A collective logic, which in subjectivity is not without collectivity. Subjectivity is not without others, first of all. And subjectivity is a wager on the future, It's about, indeed, you don't have sufficient ground, you don't have sufficient reason, but with the others, you can perform a certain act, which will retroactively create the ground on which it was sound and reasonable to perform that act. This is the logical structure of the act in the early Lacan. So in a certain way, if Lacan is criticizing Goldmann for this kind of logic, I think he's criticizing himself, because you can find easily, I think, especially in the early work, and there is suggestion that Lacan has been reading Lukács at an early age, so maybe he was influenced, but I didn't find any proof of that. Some people say it, but I didn't find any proof that Lacan would have been reading this. But still, leaving aside all these historical details, there is something.
Yeah, because you mentioned this notion of the hiatus irrationalis of the poem of Lacan, which is a beautiful point, because one way to frame the bigger dialogue that is happening here between Lacan, Goldmann, and then by extension Lukács is, of course, that Lukács, as a rationalist Hegelian, will push against, because who affirms the subject theory of the subject as bound up with a hiatus irrationalis. The neo-Kantians do that. And Lukács, in The Destruction of Reason, wants to affirm this Hegelian socialized version of the subject of thought that is not determined by the irrationalism at the core of their constitution. And I think that the Freudian revolution that Lacan is working in does have to situate a theory of the subject that would account for the death drive as the irrational gap, maybe. And in this sense, Lacan's contribution to Lukácsian, what do you call Weltanschauung? Because you see, if the claim of Goldmann and Lukács is that a class relates to the truth vis-a-vis a Weltanschauung, right? There's no place in their theory for the irrationalist core to that. If that were true, then the whole worldview of the class would not have composure. It would not have transitivity. You could also chalk it up to Lacan's maxim that there is no meta discourse. You could also say, perhaps, that one needs the supplement of Lacan in the conception of worldview in order to understand the idea that a discourse of a class is also inconsistent to itself. And you could then say that Lukács and Goldmann perform a type of idealism because they assume that the worldview of a class indeed has this, because Goldmann's working with Piaget, and there's this kind of humanist presupposition, which is a totally different theory even of fundamental human communication, right? So I suppose a lot of interpreters perceive Lacan as an anti-Marxist, as discarding Goldmann. I prefer to see it as a supplementation, that we can add Lacan's insights into the irrationalism, into a commitment to Marxist. Your thoughts on that, perhaps, and also wanted to ask you your thoughts on this other topic, which is so important, regarding the absolutization of the market, that Pascal is conditioned, or the possibility of Pascal's thought occurs at a moment when capitalism can quantify surplus value.
Yeah.
So first, perhaps, any reflections on this notion of worldview, and then second, we will go to this question.
Yes. I think I agree, or have a lot of sympathy for your idea that psychoanalysis and Lacanian psychoanalysis can be a supplement to Marxist thought, not a criticism of, or not or the meta discourse, or the one, because that's very often how if you look at psychoanalytic texts, what's so irritating about psychoanalysis, they know better. They know much better. The discourse of the one who people think something, see something, but it's actually blind. It's actually stupid. There's always one clever guy or woman in the room, and that's the psychoanalyst, you see? And this is a bit of that's not the way I think psychoanalysis works. But indeed, what is a supplement, and I think that's also Lacan has, of course, said many things and etc., and had sometimes bigger hopes and sometimes smaller hopes, let's say, with regard to psychoanalysis. But I think the small version of it, or the sobered up version of the hope one can put in psychoanalysis, is indeed that it allows you to see the phantasmatic underpinning of what you want. It's what I like, for example, very much about psychoanalysis is that it allows you to think how you're precisely attached to the thing you criticize, or the thing you want to get rid of. A lot of people are against Christianity. A lot of people are against capitalism. But the thing is how to get out of it, and this is the huge problem. And I think psychoanalysis is a theoretical tool, but of course for Lacan it was first of all a praxis, something you do. Is as a practice, it's the production of non-believers. So the whole issue, the whole task is how to become a non-believer on a fundamental level. That's one element of what psychoanalysis can bring. Another element is of course this whole idea that the analytical discourse supplements in the terrain, or in the domain of society and culture, creates a certain space where desire can be articulated, where desire can be brought into culture. And that's what Lacan deplored at the end of his life, that he was not able to, what he says, invent a new perversion. It sounds a bit maybe enigmatic, but it simply means that, to have a culture of desire and love, where because that's also what he feels in our contemporary times and society. There is no, let's say, articulation of this desire. There is no culture where you can bring desire into, let's say, where you can deal with it in a little bit of an enlightened way, with the desire which characterizes us all. And that's the basic wager of psychoanalysis.
That's very important. I just wanted to say something briefly about this, because Lacan says that Marxists in 68, 69, he says basically they need psychoanalysis because they're trying to solve this dialectic of the subject-object, the class in itself for itself problem, that comes out of Hegel, and what how can the working class kind of dialectically manage the knowledge of its own collective self-interest towards a commitment to a revolution of the social order. That's this sort of question that Lenin puts forward, and which is at the heart of a revolutionary sequence. And I think that Lacan is saying that Marxists, capitalist society doesn't allow us to have a point at which we can listen to the suffering of the proletariat. And it's not as if psychoanalysis can be some kind of public clinic where it's like we go to a protest. It's not like that. Remember that phrase he says, that the suffering, and that's also the whole point about the speech. What is the first thing he writes on the board? Psychoanalysis is a discourse without speech. And the speech of the people trying to revolutionize capitalism is getting captured by the apparatus of capital. In some ways, that capital can modulate itself to the protest. This is the thesis of the new spirit of capitalism, which is that what's novel about 68 is that capital absorbs the speech of the protesters and then creates a life philosophy off of the speech of protest. That's the ingenious adaptability of capital. In the notion of surplus extraction and surplus enjoyment, they are linked. And then, of course, he says this point about the laughter. As the point, I want to ask you that too, your thoughts on this in Capital, because I think I asked you over email to see your thoughts on this very strange point, because Lacan puts a lot of emphasis as a side point here, not to go too far, but Lacan puts a big emphasis. In chapter 7 in Marx's Capital, there's this laughter of the capitalist. It seems like a minor point. No, but Lacan says actually this is important. So why does the capitalist laugh? Is a question there. Perhaps we could move to. I guess I've also asked you about your thoughts on the absolutization of the market and the historical materialist point about Pascal, but as you wish, perhaps to respond to those questions.
What I think is the absolutization of the market, which you refer to, and the adaptability of capitalism to this, to what opposes it, or to what is it becomes protest becomes a commodity, to put it in very simple terms, is of course a huge problem, and it leads to some sort of pessimistic conclusion. And that pessimistic in the sense that the one thing I think that capitalism also produces is, and that's the whole difficulty, and that's also, I think, what Lacan also already feels in a certain way. He talks a lot about the worker, and indeed, very beautiful passages where you see the worker in itself to for itself. In Lacanian terms, you can be called a worker, and people call you a worker as objectively belonging to a certain class and performing certain function and doing certain things. And then there's a moment where you say yourself, I'm a worker, which should not change the situation in a certain way, because you simply say what you are. But it does change the situation, according to Lacan, because it opens up the possibility of naming yourself and you can either say it or not say it. And that's interesting because it's not simply workers who say I'm a worker, but it has this potentiality of opening up that people see in themselves as a worker who maybe strictly do not belong to the working class. So you have that kind of universal potential in the notion of the worker. And I think the huge problem today is that this is no longer the case. Maybe you disagree, or maybe, but this is precisely the word, the signifier doesn't work that way. And I think that's indeed that's one of the that's one of the reasons why Lacan is so hesitating with about Marxist movements in his time. Is precisely this. He how would I say, he can well articulate within his own theory the movement of the worker in itself to the worker for itself, but at the same time, I think he's has a different view on capitalism, and I think a view on capitalism which is maybe in a certain way more contemporary, in the sense that what is actually so crucial about capitalism is that it produces surpluses. On the one hand, that's actually the spectral object which forms the logic of capital, is the production of surplus. But you could also say what sort of subjectivity is produced there. It's the subjectivity of the superfluous. And that's the whole thing, it's not only the production of objects which like hide some sort of, have some charm or some alluring quality, some mysterious quality to them, which makes them, let's say, attractive and desirable. And that's very often how capitalism is criticized from a Lacanian point of view. It's to focus on these objects and the idea that for every problem there is an object. So you can get that kind of critique. That's the promise of capitalism. We can produce objects for any problem there is. And it is also accompanied very often by critique of consumerism. But I don't think you find much of that in Lacan, actually. Of course you can, but I think what you find in Lacan is much more the idea, what capitalism does, it makes objects of us all, but not just objects in a sort of reified things, but like superfluous objects. And that's why I think there is a more inherent or more intricate relation between Pascal and capitalism. So it circles around that what we are, with this economy of desire, which capitalism is, or how desire gets articulated and transformed in capitalism, you are produced as an object. So there's not a production of subjectivity in capitalism. That's obviously the promise of psychoanalysis, that you become a subject, or that you're produced as a desiring, that you testify to a desiring subjectivity. That's actually the formulae of the end of psychoanalysis, is that where you are an object, you become a subject. It's the subjectivation of an object position. But first you have to realize that you are the object, and that you are the object, you invent yourself as being the reply to the desire of the other. And that's what keeps us attached, let's say, to capital. So you are an object, and you still want to be, let's say, in one way or another, you need to invent what you could be or what you should be with relation to this desiring machine, which is capital. But I think what is crucial is indeed for today is that capital is about the production of waste, including human beings. We're all waste. Of course, this is now a bit of a pessimistic and dark thought, and I don't see how to create a politics out of that. But if it's about today about the collectivizing word, I don't think it's worker, but it's waste. This is sort of a bold statement, but I think in Lacan you find elements for this kind of argument.
No, it's good. I mean, I suppose one line of inquiry that a lot of post-Lacanians have explored. I'm even thinking here of, even though he's not exactly a strict Lacanian by any means, but even like Bernard Stiegler, will try to invent a theory of subjectivity of a new he calls the new barbarians, the new proletariat is can be determined in relationship to distinct forms of alienation vis-a-vis their lack of inclusion into the symbolic order, into the kind of, so there is still a way, I think, to think about the classic Marxist class struggle as bourgeoisie proletariat without a strict economistic definition of this class distinction. And I think that as a Marxist, one still must pursue this, because I'm always hesitant to assign Marxism as a post-class conception, because this is not in line, I think, with a true form of praxis of Marxist socialist politics that would be in the service of transforming the situation. Otherwise, I feel that we risk a naive utopianism in which we concoct a theory in which, capitalism alienates everyone the same. But if we propose that thesis, we have adopted liberalism, because liberalism also sees capitalist society without class antagonism. That would then be a form of what we would call bourgeois ideology coming in the back door. So class maybe then how is class a sticky, traumatic point that remains, would be my question. Because you're right about this point of capital as treating each subject as a detritus. That actually links to this notion of hell. We are already in hell, in a way, And I wonder about this also as like Lacan's own Augustinian, what you said before as the personal dimension of Jansenism for him in some ways, because his brother was a devout Catholic, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that this is an interesting biographical thing we could explore. But let's put aside these questions and move to a couple others, if we might, in our remaining time. Repeatedly in Seminar 16, Lacan will say, Pascal says that we understand the subject, let's say the gambler, has already embarked. And he also mentions something that, of course, the game could also be kind of thought of as one always gambles, even if they're not in some ways. I wanted to understand what this means. And I wanted to understand also what the meaning of you are already embarked means. I understand it to mean that the subject is already inducted into a discourse. Right? So and then as already being inducted into a discourse, you then talk about this notion of you put down a wager, which is not adding, but it is a subtraction. The one and the a, one divided a. Can you say more about the meaning of this notion of you were already embarked in discourse?
Sure. First of all, in Pascal, vous êtes embarqué, you are already embarked, you're already engaged, is a bit unclear, it's like a statement, a certain sloganesque almost utterance, which is not entirely convincing. But of course, it is convincing in a certain way, that if you presuppose that God possibly exists and you choose not to, that's the thing. It's very existentialist. You're like confronted with the choice to either bet on the existence of God or on his non-existence. And it's as if the libertine would say, yeah, but I'd rather not choose. And the argument or the riposte by Pascal would be, yeah, but that's also a choice. The vous êtes embarqué is that kind of, slick or like, way of presenting someone with a choice, and the moment you're presented with a choice, you're already into it, and there's no way out. Even deciding not to choose is choosing against choice. Very existentialist in a way, you know. For Lacan, vous êtes embarqué means, well, he approaches it from his theory of subjectivity, and as we then it becomes clear how serious he is about this idea that subjectivity is manque à être, is a lack of being. Yeah? And so the question of does God exist or not exist is a question about your own subjectivity, in the sense that the subject means, in a way, I mean, who am I? On what does my existence rest? What is it ultimately? This is the quest, you know. This is the question you have, and this is the quest. The subject is a question about itself, you know, is a question about its own existence, and it ends up with God as the one who would, let's say, guarantee or say what you are, but you encounter, and this is this is the level of vous êtes embarqué, in the sense that everyone, as a subject, struggles with this kind of question, who you are, and to the question who you are. Is that, where does that question come from? But that question, if you followed a little bit in a chronological, logical way, you ask this question to God, and God does not reply. God does not reply, but still God wants something from you. So what you are, in a certain way, is what you reply to God as desire. So this is the phantasmatic scenario. That's what Lacan sees in Pascal's wager. It's nothing but a phantasmatic scenario. It's a phantasmatic setting where I give different answers to what I am with respect to God. And it's this is fantasy, you know. Fantasy is the subject which relates to the object A, and the object A is precisely the phantasmatic invention of what the other wants.
Yeah.
But you can say it's phantasmatic in the context of Pascal because it guarantees that God exists in a certain way. You are profoundly a believer, in the sense that you give something to God, and by the act of giving, you expect, or you suppose the existence, you even create the existence of God. The question is, of course, why do you need to give something? That's then another question. That's interesting. There's Norman O'Brien, Life Against Death. And that's interesting because he argues that there's something excessive about human beings, and they create a surplus, and the first thing they invent is to give it, is to give it away, you know, to sacrifice it. So and it's the same logic. There is something excessive about your being, and you invent another to whom you can actually give your own excess, you know, the thing which is too much about you, and you invent another to whom you can give it. This is Norman O'Brien. For Lacan, it starts with the other. That's very often, that's really crucial to understand Lacan. Subjectivity is not about, subjectivity is reply to the desire of the other. So if you would, of course, Lacan is not a chronological thinker or like a developmental thinker, but if you would want to explain it in such a way, everything starts with the desire of the other. And the desire of the other is traumatic. Traumatic in the sense that you don't know what this other wants from you, what you are with respect to the desire of the other. So in that sense, you are embarqué, in the sense that you, in one way or another, are a reply to the desire of the other. And analysis is not about analyzing your answers. People answer this question in one way or another. And psychoanalysis is about getting to the point where you can find these answers you have invented to a fantasized, imaginarized desire in a certain way. And this is analysis.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can you say something regarding the opacity or the inconsistency of the other? Because, like, we know that the mother of the other, as even in the ethics seminar of the Das Ding, is kind of an opaque domain, ultimately, right? And Lacan will play in the four-part game theory model that you presented, with one can wager on the inconsistency of God or the not having it. So what is the meaning of the inconsistency of the other for Lacan? What is this about? It's not reducible to some kind of choice of the thought subject. What does inconsistency mean, or even this notion of the big other does not exist, right? There's a famous phrase of Lacan.
Yeah.
How might you help us with this?
Oh, it's basic. It's a very general idea. First of all, the other as the field of the other, which is a field of language, is marked by negativity, or what Lacan also calls difference. I won't go into the linguistic theory of Saussure and etc. But language is difference, and difference means deferral, and it means non-closure. So there is no last signifier, or there is. That's why Lacan is also so interested in logics, because you have language, and language is, we have the symbolic order, but actually what supports the symbolic order is mathematics, and what actually supports mathematics is logics. I mean, they have a very simple scheme. And that's why he's interested in logic, because logic ends up with paradoxes or irresolvable problems. So there is some sort, on a fundamental level, inconsistencies or irresolvable problems with the big other. Another way is the first time he discusses is to just emphasize the negativity, the whole or the desire, which is characteristic of the other. What changes in Seminar 16, is that that he introduces object A as that what guarantees, let's say, the object A is what makes sure that the other does not close upon itself. Because before you have this idea, it's a very philosophical problem. And I think this is a very difficult problem, because when you're talking about Lacan, Lacanian psychoanalysis, a lot of words can, it's all about lack, it's about inconsistency, the non-existence of the other. Yes, sure. But the words one uses for that are very often function in a way that it still closes upon itself. You know what I mean? Is, this belongs to the realm of the real. But the notion or the word of the real is used in such a way that you know what you're talking about. And that's precisely why Lacan is so, I think, hesitating to use the word, and always circling from the very early on till the end of his life about finding the right words for the non-closure of the other upon itself. And the word or the object which, let's say, guarantees this in Seminar 16 is the object A. So the object, that's one of the four quarters in the way of one of the four outcomes of the wager, is precisely that the A, if you position yourself as the object which is superfluous but still there, that your very existence is too much for the other in a certain way, creates the gap in the other. It's precisely what an analyst does too, in a certain way. The analyst occupies the position of the object and opens up, let's say, your closed story about yourself, and etc. So it's something it's a problematic existence in a way, the object A, and it's what guarantees the non-closure of the other upon itself.
Yeah. No, that's very good. I had a that is actually quite helpful, because there is a version of the wager that I was confused by, which Lacan talks about in relationship to his theory of the name of the Father. And I wanted to maybe ask you as perhaps a final question. maybe I could pose it like this. Why is Pascal a important contributor to even, I would say, the invention of this idea of the name of the Father? In a certain way, I could assume that it has to do with the fact that if Pascal is trying to retain in Christianity a continuity of the God of Revelation, this is interesting because Lacan says that Pascal never mentions the textual basis of authority, and that he retains a kind of allegiance to, I guess you could say, the Old Testament version of God. But how then does the name of the Father come into play here? If you could say something about this, because I feel that we only have really pieces of Lacan's reflections on this topic, on this concept, and it's all over the place in some sense. But perhaps you might help us pinpoint Pascal's unique operation here. Would you mind elaborating?
Well, it refers to what I was just talking about. Is you have all these notions in Lacan: phallus, name of the Father, object A, real, which of course are to be distinguished, but which all circle around a gap, let's say. And the whole problem is not to think what you're talking about by simply using these words or simply referring to the gap or the inconsistency of the other, and etc. So it's all names which in one way, in a different way, refer to this, to some sort of fundamental, to some structural lack. And the first thing the name of the Father does for Lacan is to, given the fact that the other is marked by a lack, it's still, let's say, it's a bit like the pépère I talked about in my presentation. It's knowing, it's the Father who knows. There is no ultimate guarantee of the other, but still, let's say, says to you in a certain way, you have a place within the symbolic order. There is a symbolic order, and the symbolic order awaits you. There's a place reserved. The name of the Father is, let's say, that instance which talks about you within the symbolic even before you're born. That's why also the name of the Father, literally speaking, it's the name you get before you're even born. So this is the kind of this is the name of the Father, and you could say this is the two sides to the Father. That's the one side of the Father we know, the guarantor of the symbolic order. You could say that's the God of the philosophers, the God of philosophy who guarantees that there is an order, that there is a certain consistency, even if it's not always clear to us. We can remain convinced or rest assured that there is some sort of coherence to the symbolic order. But of course, there's a big enigma of what the Father wants. And this is the other side of the Father. It's the desiring Father. Why would he actually, or what does he actually want from you? So this is the Janus-faced or the double-faced nature of the name of the Father. And I think this is what Lacan particularly likes in Pascal, is on the one hand the absolute modernity of his thought. So it's not some vague religious, blah blah. It's really a plea, an apology for logics. Pascal is a scientist, and Pascal believes that nature is written in mathematical formulae, just like Lacan does. Lacan is also not into poetic formulations about the tragic how tragic it is to exist and endless desire and etc. No, it's a mathematical and game theoretical and logical approach to subjectivity. So that's what he sees in Pascal that makes him, like, let's say, some sort of affinity. And in the heart of that modern discourse you get the reappearance of a desiring God, which is precisely this combination. On the one hand, austere, severe, logical thinking, and on the other hand, the problem par excellence is grace. And you would think the divine will. This is the problem we need to think about. And this is, of course, fascinating. How can you be at the same time so modern and so also modest, in the sense that like a scientist, we do not know whether God exists. For the start, God exists, or he proves that it exists. Pascal does not engage in a proof that God exists. He could just as well not exist. But given that situation, we can approach in a mathematical, sound way. But that God, then thinking about God, what is God? It's not some sort of guarantee, a non-deceiving, good-willing God. No, it's an opaque voice which addresses it to you, and you don't understand what's being said. And that's the...
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. I mean, this notion of, even from Totem and Taboo, of a you would think that the God of revelation is the non-castrated God, but one of Pascal's innovations is he teaches the subject how to renounce this problem of hedonism, this problem of enjoyment, which is tied to capital and surplus, obviously. Does that also mean that Pascal changes or keeps this Old Testament God in modernity in some ways by making this God a hidden God? If that's true, then is this God the same? It's also a lacking God, is it not? Because we already discussed this notion of the inconsistency of God.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? In other words, is there a relationship between this Pascal as a kind of, I don't know, innovative thinker regarding the name of the Father, and this achievement that he makes about also teaching the subject of modern life how to renounce their desire in a certain way? So perhaps I might ask you as an encore question something about the meaning of renunciation and why the libertines and the hedonist subject, why Pascal can teach them something about renunciation, and how that might or might not relate to this version of God which I assume was this non-castratable God, right? This kind of pure God. Does that make sense? Like how might we weave these two together?
Yeah, that's something I need to think about. But about renunciation, what is interesting is that renunciation here concerns your total life. It's total giving up your life, and like in investing it in with the prospect of a future gain. And this is the idea, this is the modern, let's say, capitalist idea about renunciation. It's total self-annihilation. That's why I also think pure love is actually maybe the best way to approach the 17th century problem of pure love. It's like present in Pascal, but he keeps it out of sight because of this hedonist calculus, which, sounds rational. I do something and I get something in return. But actually, it's total... this renunciation is the total annihilation, is an obliteration, I don't know whether that's the right word, of your self interest and your own life, With at the same time,
which is nothing to do with capitalist. That is the opposite of the capitalist conception of risk and gambling, is it not? I mean, why would anybody invest with such a philosophy? It doesn't sound like a capitalist.
It sounds capitalist because it's about your gain belongs to the future. Invest if you what is the difference between money? You know this much better than I do. What is the difference between money and capital? is that capital you lose. It's money you invest, and it's the moment you invest it, you lose it. But it is gambling on the future. It is expecting it to get it returned. And this is a new idea, this futurization, sorry for this neologism, futurization of the present. You know, you deny the present is marked by loss, is by a thing has only value to the extent that you can actually stake it, that you can actually give it away, but with the idea that it may be returned to you with a surplus in the future. So that's, I think, what is very capitalist and very modern about it, is this future, again, is this futurization, or the becoming your belonging of your existence to the future and not so much to the present or to the past. Would you agree with that?
I suppose so, but it just sounds strange to form a homology between this idea, which I understand Lacan to be almost making a clinical claim about this theory of subjective destitution. Because one of the things that always concerns me as somebody that has done psychoanalysis myself, and my analyst was actually trained by Lacan, by the way, is this idea that one would ever approach the relationship between analyst and analysand through this investment capital logic. But I suppose that you're sort of suggesting this in a certain way. And one maybe could say it's inescapable. That, in other words, we are marked and conditioned by capitalism even within the clinic, right? And no,
we were deeply marked by capital. We were deeply marked by capitalism, and the only that would be Lacan's point, a little bit simplified and exaggerated. The only hope is the analytical discourse, and that's the only thing he worked on. When he started teaching, it was really out of the necessity. He was already in his 50s. It was out of the necessity to think what happens when one does analysis, and also what's the promise of psychoanalysis, and which eventually led to this whole idea that you have different discourses which operate, which are functioning, which involve different subject positions, and there is one new discourse, the analytical discourse, which is symptomatic in a way, which only occurs within a certain historical constellation, which is modernity. And that's why, but the only hope one can put on, indeed, I think you could say capitalist subjectivity. The only hope you can have is indeed, for Lacan, I don't know, but for Lacan, it's the analytical discourse which can undo what ties you to capital. All these things I've been describing are like a very profound, is a profound knot, is a knotting together of a certain particular form of subjectivity and a particular form of some sort of surplus enjoyment you suppose to the other. And a way to undo that is psychoanalysis. And then the whole thing is, can we imagine psychoanalysis out of the confines of the cabinet? Is it only in the analyst's working place that analysis takes place, or that the analytical discourse can exist, can operate, can function, or can one imagine that it functions elsewhere? This is a question I just raised. I cannot answer.
No, this is essential, because Lacan has the fifth discourse, of which he says, if the fifth discourse is successful, it would obliterate the discourse of the analyst. So there is, therefore, a kind of implicit subversive potential in Lacanian psychoanalysis. Well, then you say, well, then does that mean that the ideology of Lacanian psychoanalysts are somehow opposed to capitalism? Of course, the answer is no. It's different. It's different than that. Yeah. But anyways, my friend, thank you, Dominiek. I want to applaud your efforts and this great talk, which we are very honored to host on our show. Thank you for bringing this research to our doorstep. And you will have a article building off of this in a forthcoming book.
Yes, it's a book on Seminar XVI. edited by Emily Laurent Monaghan, which will appear in 2025 with Palgrave.
Absolutely. And our good friend Paris is a co-editor who
exactly. Sorry, yes,
yeah, and he gave a great presentation very recently. So we'll close and we'll leave it at that, and hope to have you back to discuss Lacan in the future.
Thank you for your patience. Good night.
All the best.